About 25 miles northeast of what is now Mexico City, there stands a monument to a mystery that has haunted archaeologists for over a century. The ancient city of Teotihuacan rises from the Mexican Highland Valley, its massive pyramids reaching toward the sky like stone prayers frozen in time. When you stand before these structures today, you're looking at a city that was already ancient when the Aztecs discovered it, already abandoned for 700 years, already silent. The Pyramid of the Sun towers over 200 feet high, one of the largest structures ever built in the pre-Columbian Americas. But here's what truly captures the imagination: we don't know who built it. We don't know what they called themselves. We don't even know what language they spoke. And most mysteriously of all, we don't know why they left. The name Teotihuacan wasn't given to this place by its builders. When the Aztec people stumbled upon these ruins sometime in the 14th century, they found a ghost city of such magnificent scale that they could only explain it through mythology. They named it Teotihuacan, which in their Nahuatl language means the place where the gods were created or the place where men become gods. The Aztecs believed that the gods themselves had gathered here to create the sun and the moon after the last world had ended. They had no knowledge of who actually built these pyramids, no records, no stories passed down through generations. Even to them, a civilization that would itself build great cities, Teotihuacan was already a relic of a forgotten age. They claimed some spiritual connection to the people who had lived here, but the truth had been swallowed by time. Teotihuacan's story begins around the year 100 BCE, when the first settlers established what would become one of the ancient world's most remarkable urban centers. But the city's explosive growth came from tragedy. Around this time, a nearby rival city called Coahuilco was thriving in the same valley basin. Both cities were roughly equal in size. Both were productive centers of trade and artisanship. Then Mount Zittel, an active volcano located southwest of present-day Mexico City, erupted with devastating force. The eruption buried much of Coahuilco and destroyed the agricultural lands that sustained it. Some scholars believe an even earlier eruption of Popocatépetl volcano in the middle of the 1st century had already weakened the region. When Zittel exploded, thousands of displaced people had to flee their homes. Many of them found refuge in Teotihuacan, and the city's population began to swell dramatically. What might have remained a modest settlement transformed into something unprecedented. By the time Teotihuacan reached its zenith between 100 CE and 500 CE, it had become the largest city in all of the Americas. Archaeological evidence suggests the population reached somewhere between 100,000 and 125,000 inhabitants, though some estimates push even higher. To put this in perspective, this was larger than contemporary Rome at certain periods. The city covered approximately 8 square miles. Meticulously planned on a grid layout that demonstrates sophisticated urban design principles. There were roughly 2,000 single-story apartment compounds arranged throughout the city, along with numerous pyramids, plazas, temples, and palaces. The residents weren't just farmers clustering around a ceremonial center. This was a true cosmopolitan metropolis, with specialized neighborhoods for different ethnic groups, districts for various crafts and trades, and a complex social hierarchy that supported everything from laborers to priests to the ruling elite. Running through the heart of Teotihuacan is a broad thoroughfare that the Aztecs would later call Mecatli, or the Avenue of the Dead. This wasn't the street's original name, of course, but rather the Aztecs' interpretation of what they saw, a long ceremonial path flanked by what they thought were tombs. Modern archaeology has shown these weren't burial sites at all, but rather the bases of temples and palaces. The avenue stretches for more than 1.5 miles across the city, oriented 15 to 25 degrees east of true north. This wasn't an accident or imprecision. Teotihuacan's entire layout was deliberately aligned with astronomical phenomena. The front wall of the Pyramid of the Sun, for instance, is exactly perpendicular to the point on the horizon where the sun sets during the equinoxes. The city was a massive astronomical instrument, its very architecture encoding the movements of celestial bodies and sacred calendar cycles. One of Teotihuacan's most fascinating characteristics was its multi-ethnic composition. Archaeological evidence reveals distinct neighborhoods where different cultural groups maintain their own identities while contributing to the city's greater whole. There were quarters inhabited by Zapotec peoples from Oaxaca, Maya peoples from the south, Mixtec communities, and groups speaking languages ancestral to modern Totonac and Nahuatl. In 2001, linguist Terence Kaufman presented evidence suggesting that important ethnic groups in Teotihuacan were of Totonacan or Mixoquian linguistic affiliation. Other scholars argue that Otomi-speaking peoples formed the largest population group, since Otomi was known to be spoken in the area both before and after Teotihuacan's classical period. This cosmopolitan mixture made Teotihuacan more like ancient Rome or medieval Constantinople than a typical Mesoamerican city-state. People came from across Mesoamerica, bringing their traditions, their gods, their crafts, and their knowledge, weaving them together into something entirely unique. During its golden age, roughly between 150 CE and 450 CE, Teotihuacan wasn't merely a large city. It was a power that cast its influence across Mesoamerica like a shadow. Evidence of Teotihuacan's presence appears in archaeological sites throughout the region, from Veracruz on the Gulf Coast to Maya territories in modern Guatemala. Maya murals from this period depict Teotihuacan warriors and nobles, recording encounters with this dominant civilization. The city was an economic powerhouse, with perhaps 1/3 of its population working as specialized artisans producing goods for trade. Obsidian tools, fine pottery, elaborate textiles, and precious goods flowed out from Teotihuacan's workshops along extensive trade routes. The city's architectural style, particularly its distinctive tablero construction where sloped walls alternate with vertical rectangular panels, was copied by other Mesoamerican cities seeking to emulate Teotihuacan's prestige and power. Here's something that makes Teotihuacan deeply unusual among ancient civilizations: there's no clear evidence of individual rulers. Most Mesoamerican cities, particularly the Maya, are famous for their powerful kings who had their faces carved onto monuments and who were buried in lavish tombs filled with treasures. Teotihuacan has none of this. There are no royal portraits, no glorified images of conquering warriors, no identified burial sites of great leaders. Some archaeologists, like George Cowgill, argue that the city must have been ruled by an all-powerful king, because that was simply how complex societies of this scale were organized. But if such rulers existed, they left behind no trace of personal glorification. The art and architecture of Teotihuacan instead depicts offices and deities, emphasizing collective religious identity rather than individual power. This has led other scholars to propose that Teotihuacan might have been governed by a council of elite families or competing groups who maintained a delicate balance of power through cooperation rather than domination by a single dynasty. Around 500 to 600 CE, subtle changes began appearing in Teotihuacan's archaeological record. The population, which had remained relatively stable at its peak for centuries, started to decline. New construction slowed. The city's influence over distant regions began to weaken as other centers started asserting their independence. Trade networks that had channeled wealth into Teotihuacan for generations became less reliable. Up to one-third of the city's residents worked as specialized artisans, and when long-distance trade faltered, the economic foundation of many neighborhoods began to crumble. Some conquered outposts, located far from Teotihuacan's direct control, proved difficult and expensive to maintain. The costs of empire were mounting, and the city's ability to sustain its massive population through tribute and trade was being tested. Something was beginning to unravel in this great metropolis, though the people living through these changes might not have recognized it as the beginning of the end. As we continue our journey through the mystery of Teotihuacan's abandonment, we'll explore what happened next, the theories that archaeologists have developed, and the clues hidden in the ruins themselves. But for now, let these first 9 facts settle into your mind like dust settling over ancient stones, and let yourself drift into peaceful contemplation of this lost civilization and its enduring mysteries. Around the year 550 CE, something catastrophic happened in Teotihuacan. Fire swept through the ceremonial heart of the city. The major monuments along the Street of the Dead were deliberately set ablaze. In the compound of Zala, one of the ruling elite's palatial structures located near the Moon Pyramid, archaeologists have found clear evidence of violent destruction. Sculptures were intentionally smashed into fragments and scattered. A magnificent calcite marble figure, standing over 4 feet tall, was broken apart and its pieces strewn across the compound. In the Ciudadela, the great plaza that housed the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, researchers discovered a layer of ash and charcoal 6 centimeters thick covering the outer platform. More than 100 structures burned during this event. But here's what makes this fire particularly revealing: it wasn't a random disaster or an attack by foreign invaders. The destruction was selective and purposeful. The palaces burned. The temples burned. The administrative buildings burned. But the residential compounds where ordinary people lived remained largely untouched. The pattern of destruction tells a story that archaeologists are still piecing together. When examining which buildings were destroyed and which were spared, researchers noticed something striking. The fire targeted symbols of power and authority while leaving the homes of common citizens intact. This wasn't the work of external enemies looting and pillaging as they conquered. Foreign invaders would have destroyed everything, taken what they could carry, and left ruins behind indiscriminately. Instead, this looked like an internal uprising, a revolution by Teotihuacan's own people against their ruling class. Linda Manzanilla, an archaeologist from Mexico's National Autonomous University, has studied the social tensions that might have led to such an event. She examined the neighborhood of Teotihuacan and found evidence of a deeply divided society. There was a corporate elite at the top who controlled access to raw materials and trade goods. Below them was what she calls an intermediate elite, skilled craftspeople who had gained their own wealth and status through their mastery of trades. These artisans, painters, builders, and merchants had become economically powerful, but they remained excluded from true political authority. The tension between these groups, between old power and new wealth, between those who ruled and those who produced, may have reached a breaking point. But revolution doesn't happen in a vacuum. People don't burn down their own city unless something has pushed them to desperation. And around the same time as Teotihuacan's troubles, something extraordinary was happening to Earth's climate. In the year 535 CE, followed by another eruption in 536, massive volcanic eruptions occurred somewhere in the world, possibly in Iceland, though some scholars point to the infamous Krakatoa in Indonesia. These weren't ordinary eruptions. The power generated would have been equivalent to thousands of nuclear bombs. Vast quantities of volcanic ash were thrown into the atmosphere, where they circulated as an aerosol fog that blocked sunlight for 18 months. Medieval historian Michael McCormick has called 536 the worst year to be alive. Global temperatures dropped by 1.5 to 2.5 degrees Celsius. The sun appeared dim, giving light without brightness, as one Byzantine historian wrote, shining more like the moon than the sun. The following summer was the coldest in 2,300 years. This volcanic winter would cast its shadow across human civilization for over a century. The volcanic eruptions of 535 and 536 CE triggered a cascade of climatic changes that would devastate civilizations around the world. When the sun's heat was blocked by volcanic particles in the atmosphere, the oceans no longer evaporated as they should. The atmosphere became drier. Rainfall patterns shifted and diminished. In central Mexico, including the region around Teotihuacan, the climate records tell a grim story. Scientists studying stalagmites from Juxtlahuaca Cave in Guerrero have reconstructed the rainfall history of the region going back thousands of years. These cave formations grow as mineral-rich water drips from stalactites, and they preserve the chemical signatures of rainfall in their layers, like tree rings made of stone. What they reveal is striking. A 30-year drought began in the mid-6th century, right around the time of the volcanic eruptions. The drought extended beyond 150 years as part of a 500-year drying trend. Research from multiple sites confirms this pattern. Tree growth was dramatically reduced throughout the region. Lake levels dropped. The evidence suggests rainfall decreased by as much as 40% or more during this period. For a city of Teotihuacan's size, a prolonged drought was not merely an inconvenience. It was an existential crisis. Consider the mathematics of survival. At its peak, Teotihuacan housed perhaps 125,000 people within 8 square miles. About 2/3 of the residents were farmers who cultivated the surrounding lands using sophisticated irrigation systems and raised field agriculture. The rest were the artisans, merchants, soldiers, priests, and administrators who depended on those farmers to feed them. The city's entire economic system was built on agricultural surplus. When the rains failed year after year, the crops failed with them. The maize withered in the fields. The beans didn't produce. The irrigation canals ran dry. Archaeological evidence from this period shows a disproportionate number of juvenile skeletons, particularly babies, dating to the mid to late 6th century. Many of these young bones show signs of malnutrition and disease. The population was starving, and the youngest and most vulnerable were dying first. This wasn't just a food shortage. It was famine, stretching across years and then decades. When crops fail and people go hungry, they look to their leaders for solutions. In Teotihuacan, those leaders were failing. The priests who conducted elaborate ceremonies to ensure cosmic balance couldn't make the rains return. The administrators who managed the city's complex economy couldn't distribute food that didn't exist. The warriors who had once projected Teotihuacan's power across Mesoamerica couldn't conquer their way out of a climate catastrophe. Evidence suggests that civic services began breaking down in Teotihuacan's final years. Construction quality deteriorated. Buildings that were erected during this period were less well-made than those from earlier times. The sophisticated maintenance systems that had kept the city functioning smoothly for centuries were no longer being properly maintained. Archaeologists have found evidence that people became more wary of their neighbors, building barriers between compounds where none had existed before. The social fabric was tearing. Trust was eroding. And through it all, the intermediate elite, Those skilled craftspeople and merchants who had gained their own wealth and status, watched as the traditional ruling class proved incapable of managing the crisis. As if drought and famine weren't enough, recent archaeological studies have revealed another potential factor in Teotihuacan's collapse: earthquakes. Researchers examining damage patterns in the city's major structures have identified evidence of at least 5 significant seismic events between the years 1 CE and 550 CE. The damage is distinctive and unmistakable. Walls collapsed in oriented patterns consistent with horizontal shaking. Staircases show specific types of damage that occur during earthquakes. In the Pyramid of the Sun, the Old Temple of the Feathered Serpent, and the Atasada platform, archaeologists have documented what they call floating dipping broken corners, a newly identified type of earthquake damage. The residents even attempted architectural solutions to repair earthquake damage, modifications that are still visible in the ruins today. These earthquakes may have been megathrust events with magnitudes exceeding 8.5, originating from the Middle American Trench along the Pacific coast, hundreds of miles away but powerful enough to shake buildings in the highlands. Imagine the psychological impact. The earth itself was rebelling, the ground beneath the Great Pyramids was unstable, and even the massive stone monuments that had stood for centuries were cracking and crumbling. Teotihuacan's power had never rested solely on the agricultural productivity of its immediate surroundings. The city was the hub of vast trade networks that stretched across Mesoamerica. Obsidian from nearby quarries was worked by skilled artisans and exported throughout the region. Fine pottery, textiles, and other luxury goods flowed out along trade routes, while tribute and exotic materials flowed back in. But as the city weakened internally, these networks began to fail. Distant territories that had once acknowledged Teotihuacan's dominance started asserting their independence. Other cities, sensing opportunity in Teotihuacan's troubles, began to rise. The city of Xochicalco to the south was growing more powerful. Trade routes that had enriched Teotihuacan for generations became less reliable. The tributary system that had supplemented the city's resources started to collapse. For the estimated third of the population who worked as specialized artisans rather than farmers, this was devastating. Without reliable access to raw materials and without markets for their goods, entire neighborhoods lost their economic foundation. The workshops fell silent. The kilns grew cold. The economic engine that had sustained such a large urban population was sputtering and dying. By 550 CE, multiple crises had converged on Teotihuacan like gathering storm clouds. There was the decades-long drought that had dried up water sources and destroyed agricultural productivity. There was the famine that was killing the city's children and weakening its adult population. There were the earthquakes that had damaged major structures and shaken people's faith in the stability of their world. There was the breakdown of trade networks that had enriched the city and provided resources from distant lands. There was the erosion of civic authority as the ruling elite proved unable to solve these compounding problems. There was the growing resentment of the intermediate classes who had wealth and skills but no political power. And there was the simple, terrible fact that Teotihuacan had grown too large to sustain itself when the rains failed. The city had reached what researchers call a tipping point, that moment when multiple stresses compound each other until the entire system becomes unstable. Something had to give. And around 550 CE, it did. The fires were set. The monuments were burned. The sculptures were smashed. The old order was violently overthrown, not by foreign invaders, but by Teotihuacan's own desperate, starving, angry people. And yet, the burning of the monuments wasn't the end of Teotihuacan's story. The city would continue to be inhabited for another century or more, though it would never again achieve its former glory. As we continue our journey through this mystery, we'll explore what happened after the Great Fire, how the city limped along in its diminished state, and what final factors led to its ultimate abandonment. But for now, rest with these images of fire and ash, of hunger and upheaval, of a great civilization brought low by forces both natural and human.